A little over a year ago today, Lycoris Recoil aired its final episode. Some years before that, Shinichiro Kashiwada was in a meeting with novelist Asaura's editor. This meeting would be the genesis of Lycoris. Welcome to the story of how Lycoris was made, how it was received by the wider anime community, my initial impression of it, and how my opinion changed upon rewatch. Shinichiro Kashiwada is the representative director of and a producer at A1 Pictures, the studio that would eventually release Lycoris. Although the meeting between Kashiwada and Asaura's editor was for a completely unrelated work, Kashiwada had read Death Need Round, a series of 3 novels written by Asaura himself. Upon reading them, he got the impression that Asaura was completely and utterly unhinged. Obviously, this meant that the only logical choice from that point forward was to have him write the plot for an original TV anime. Asaura was told to write freely, so he wrote Lycoris with the same mindset he had when writing Death Need Round. He disregarded ethics, sales, target audience, theming, and the fact that it was going to be on TV, and proceeded to make something that couldn't be aired on TV. The original draft of Lycoris had our heroes sinking their enemies in pools of blood during the finale. That's awesome! I can also totally see why that draft was rejected. So, Asaura rewrote the story from the ground up into something far more in line with what the final product ended up being. It's around this stage that director Shingo Adachi was brought onto the project. Lycoris was Adachi's first time directing a full TV anime, and his presence would end up altering the show's writing, tone, characterization, and atmosphere in significant ways. In particular, he helped change Chisato, one of the main characters, from bitter and justice-driven to cheerful and energetic. The work overall became less grave in tone, with more comedic and lighthearted moments. One of Adachi's goals with the project was to make the viewer smile at least once every 5 minutes. Although, interestingly enough, Asaura said he thinks the story actually became harsher after Adachi joined, because although there are more lighthearted moments now, they only serve to make the gruesome and violent ones stand out all the darker. It's not like the story's fundamental concept changed with Adachi joining the fray, but the way in which it was expressed transformed significantly. A once vague collection of ideas with significant holes in its construction was now taking on a clearer form, with systems like DA and the licorice being added in by Adachi to justify the story elements Asaura had already written. All of a sudden, the prospect of this becoming an anime began feeling real to Asaura. Adachi may be new as a director, but he's been in the industry for a long time as an animator. While working as an animator, he collected lots of ideas for how he'd do things if he was director, which he then stowed away in his brain. Once he got the chance to be director for Lycoris, he decided to use the project as a dumping ground for all the ideas he had built up over the years, in an attempt at breaking the mold. In addition, he tried to use his position as a relative outsider to directing work to his advantage, being more directly involved in the scripting process than usual, and frequently inserting his own flavor into the story. He also fixated on realistic-feeling character interactions and character acting, which we'll dive into later. I like reading interviews from mangaka and anime staff in general, but these ones are particularly interesting to me. It's such a uniquely conceived, albeit chaotically constructed, show, and it's just fun to learn about. Once again, interviews and further reading are linked in the description. Lycoris came out during the summer 2022 anime season, and immediately took the community by storm. You could pin some of this on the fact that summer 2022 was a dry AF season for anime, at least in my correct subjective opinion. But if you ask me, Lycoris would have been a successful show no matter how much competition it had. According to Asaura, each of the people who worked on the show have a different personal explanation as to why it was a success. If you ask me, I don't think there's any one aspect of the show you could pin as even the primary reason why it got so big. But what I can say is that it makes complete sense to me why this, of all things, is popular. Its main characters are cute and beautiful, with stellar character designs by Muru Imigi, which is obviously going to bring eyes towards the project. But there's also nothing in the show I'd call full-throttled fan service, so you can still feel classy about watching it and show it to your parents. The show has deep ideological and political themes, so pretentious hacks, like me, can enjoy it. But there's nothing so complicated that people who failed serial experiments high, also like me, can't understand what's happening. It has solid production values, directing that sets it apart from your average anime, broad appeal to both men and women, cool action, it stands out from every other show that was airing at the time, and above all, it's just competent. It feels like something humans were meant to watch, as opposed to isekai. So, taking all that into account, the first time I sat down to watch it, I obviously didn't like it. Don't click off, guys. I rewatched it and enjoyed myself a lot more this time. Paradoxical to my dislike for the show, Lycoris Recoil has lived in my head rent-free ever since I watched it. I'm not a hot takes guy anymore. If the sheeple like something, I'm typically right there with the flock. But back in the day, I had a bone to pick with this show, man, and I still kinda do. Even from the first episode, I couldn't get hooked into its characters, and while around the halfway point I was starting to enjoy myself, by the time the show concluded, I had gone right back to bitter disappointment, especially with the finale, and I wasn't alone in my assessment. At least from my perspective, as someone in the English-speaking anime community, I saw a slight uptick in negative Lycoris takes around the time it concluded, though that's just based on my personal experience. I don't have any data to back this up, beyond cherry-picked Mal reviews. To this day, the show is still above an 8 on Mal and AniList, with the average review overwhelmingly skewing positive. Because it's so uncommon for me to be a contrarian anymore, when a new Lycoris Recoil animation project, possibly season 2, or a recap movie, was announced, I knew what had to be done. Namely, forcing you, yes you, to listen to my experience rewatching the show. And you know what? I don't hate the show anymore. That's right, your name ain't the only thing getting a Crunchy Bagels redemption arc this year. I've also turned from a Lycoris hater to a Lycoris fairly ambivalenter. Hey, improvement's improvement. My head is filled with infinite thoughts about licorice big and small. Some good thoughts, some bad, and some in between. I can definitely say that Lycoris is one of the most memorable shows to come out in the past few years. So let's just jump into it. Be warned though, this is where the big O spoilers begin. Lycoris follows the story of Chisato Nishikigi and Takina Inoue on their journey to find and maintain autonomy. This is told through an action show with cute girls, guns, and ideological overtones. That's a comically brief overview. We'll get into the weeds later, but right now, I want to talk about how the show endears you to its characters. What I think this show excels at more than anything in terms of its character writing is just making the characters and the way they interact with each other fun. It's pretty obvious why someone like Chisato has so many fans. She's energetic, bubbly, and stuffed with charm in the way she interacts with the world. But somewhat underrated is the, in my opinion, funnier and far more enjoyable Takina. She's deadpan and businesslike, particularly at the beginning of the show before she's gone through her arc. And the show sells this in some incredibly witty ways. Take, for example, episode 4, when Chisato tells Takina to bring her casual clothes to a shopping trip. Upon hearing this, Takina asks Mika if they have any designated plain clothes, as if they're a uniform of some kind. The way Takina's brain is wired, she's so hyper-pragmatic that she only thinks about clothing in terms of their practicality. She just doesn't get pretty clothing. And really, you can do this same thing with every other character, because they all have their fair share of quotable lines, like Kurumi telling Mizuki, "Oh man, you're still alive," or Mizuki, who's 27, telling someone, "Although I look like a teenager, I'm actually 20 years old." Brilliant.
Well, my name is Gormedios, and I'm a 400-year-old vampire, but I actually appear to be 13.
Even the small character moments are filled with charm in the way they're depicted. Kurumi is experiencing more joy from stealing this watermelon slice than you will feel in your entire life. think about that. What struck me specifically upon rewatch is that this show is just funny. Like, way funnier than I remembered it being. It's not like every joke is laugh-out-loud worthy, but at least speaking personally, Adachi succeeded in his goal of making me smile at least once every 5 minutes, at least during the more chilled-out scenes. I said earlier that Adachi wanted to make the character interactions feel realistic, and I think he succeeded. This feels like banter between real people, as opposed to your ordinary anime shenanigans. It helps you buy into the kayfabe of the show as a whole, and especially the cafe setting. You, as the viewer, really start to view the cafe almost like a home for the characters, the one place of safety they have in such a dangerous world. The slice of life scenarios are just plain charming as well. Like, seeing Takina try to get the cafe's finances in order because they keep bleeding money, and witnessing all the ways in which she gets them back in the green, eventually culminating in her and Kurumi getting into stock trading, is a ton of fun. Or stuff like Chisato cheating-ish at rock paper scissors to dump all the chores on Takina, only for her to give the most horrified expression I've seen in my life. Which leads me to another thing. The character acting and expressions in this show are great. Look at these two cuts in episode 5, and notice the way Kurumi runs toward the window before chucking the drone out of it. The entire motion has this sense of weight to it that makes it feel like Kurumi really is a part of the setting. The way she moves her arms as she runs, coupled with her oversized sleeves and the way in which she hurls the drone, gives her the impression of a bumbling child, which is what she is. Well, she's actually a very small adult, but she's a brat, so it fits. And mind you, this is one of the more subtle examples I know of. Basically anytime Chisato moves, like, at all, the storyboarders and animators throw in some spice to make it more entertaining, like her incredible Bruce Lee impression in episode 8, or when she's doing a thinking pose on the toilet in episode 7, or the way she clings to the fence while excitedly rambling about a sports car in episode 2. The emphasis on character acting is extremely noticeable in this show, and Adachi, as well as the individual storyboarders and animators on each episode, knocked it out of the park. The facial expressions are consistently screen cappable too. Smug Kurumi. Just look at her. I've never wanted to punch a child more than Kurumi with this face. This all might sound like fluff in the grand scheme of things, and like I'm avoiding talking about the important parts of the show, but I don't see it that way. If this stuff wasn't important, the staff wouldn't have put in the effort to knock it out of the park so hard, and it really did heighten the experience of my rewatch. But you got me! Let's talk about the two main characters, and how I feel about them. People really tend to gravitate towards Chisato, but like I said earlier, I've always preferred Takina. I think her deadpan demeanor is delightfully depicted, but what makes her an even better character is the fact that she has an extremely well-handled arc. This might have been harder to pick up on while watching it weekly, but when you're binging the show like I did, you really notice the subtle ways in which Takina brightens up over the course of the series. She starts off as a girl dedicated to DA, I'll explain what that is later, who rarely emotes and who is a wee bit reckless when it comes to endangering the lives of innocents. But in episode 3, she manages to let go of much of her attachment to DA, and in doing so is able to lighten up in her new surroundings. She finds friendship and the ability to have fun, and by the end of the show, all she cares about anymore is saving her bride-to-be, earnest friend Chisato, even if it means disobeying DA's orders. Her personality grows so much softer and like, you just wanna hug her. Chisato is overrated. Adachi said in an interview that he sees Chisato almost as an idealized woman. Exceptionally positive, doesn't shut others down, intelligent, cool, treats everyone equally, relaxed, naturally feeling around her, always wants to get up close with you. She's the perfect ideal. Chisato was always meant to be someone already at the end of her arc, from the beginning of the show. That way, she could be the sort of mentor figure to allow Takina to grow and become her best self. Chisato's struggle isn't growing as a person, but rather in maintaining the lifestyle she's already grown into. But I don't think an idealized character with no more growing to do is all that interesting. Believe it or not, I don't go to anime to see perfect women. I go to anime to see people who are rough around the edges and have some growing to do. And even if they don't end up having an arc, I just generally prefer it when the cast is comprised of idiots, dorks, and assholes. Of course, flaw can be a bit of a tricky word here, especially since what counts as a flaw changes depending on who you ask. And if Sakamoto has taught me anything, it's that characters needing flaws is far from a set-in-stone rule. There are absolutely ways to make a character interesting other than making them flawed, and it's not like giving them flaws will automatically make them better. But comparing Takina and Chisato, I feel like much of what endeared me to one far more than the other is that Takina had growing to do. Chisato is just barely within the realm of being too idealized for me to love her as much as everyone else seems to. There are aspects of Chisato's character you could consider flaws depending on your beliefs, namely her rigidly sticking to pacifism and her self-admittedly limited worldview. But the series never critiques anything she does, because that was never the intention, so once again, nothing about her is really portrayed as a negative. But what about the depth of Chisato's character? Surely that counts for something. And you're right, Chisato does have an ideology and history to her, and it did in fact do just a little for me. But while this is obviously a hot take, I don't think the show went anywhere interesting enough with those aspects of her character for me to feel truly invested. The most interesting part of her backstory to me was the idea that she'd been living out someone else's mission her entire life, but had unintentionally fallen off course, causing Yoshimatsu to try and correct said course. I honestly think I would have fallen in love with Chisato's character if the series got really existential with it, and made it so that Chisato hadn't actually deviated from her intended course. Then, she figures out that she's been living out someone else's mission and has to struggle with all her might to regain control over the trajectory of her life. I don't know, I'm writing Lycoris fanfiction at this point just to make a version of Chisato that's interesting to me. All that leaves then is her surface level personality. And you know what? I do think she's fun, but not nearly fun enough to carry her character single-handedly. As one last middle finger to all the Chisato fans, I've always found Takina way funnier and more likable. Obviously, you're free to disagree, but come on, Takina's just superior in every way. Overall, Chisato is not a bad character. Far from it. But my investment in the lead characters is severely lopsided, with Takina easily stealing the show as my favorite character. Kurumi, Mizuki, and Mika are all great and serve their purpose, but I'm intentionally neglecting to go into depth for the sake of time. As an animator, director Adachi would sometimes wonder what the point of the cut he was drawing was. So, when tasked with directing Lycoris, he tried to give each cut at least two purposes, to save resources and ensure that no cuts feel like they're there just to be there. And you can feel this emphasis on making the most of the runtime, both in terms of visuals and story. Shots consistently feel evocative and purposeful. I'm especially partial to this shot of Majima with a cracked glass wall behind him, and all these sunset-lit shots in the finale. Obviously, the storyboarders and animators also get some of the credit for the shots consistently looking as good as they do. But Adachi did a good job of selling the overall visual direction of the show's shot composition. The world design feels fully realized, and the show overall has a clear visual identity. Unfortunately, I don't think Lycoris is ever an incredible show. I think it has a lot of good moments, and even a few banger ones, but its characters, while overall good, aren't nearly appealing enough for me to call this a certified bagel-approved classic. Like, a single chapter of Zaregoto will, on average, have more intricate and better characterization than this entire show. Lycoris is just fun, and maybe there's nothing wrong with that. Or at least, I would say that. But episode 13 happened, so unfortunately there's still half the video left. Okay, never forget what they took from us, but like, never forget what they took from us. The character designer for Lycoris Recoil is Muru Imigi. In the Heroine Archive fanbook, he released some of the beta designs for the characters, which I have on screen right now. I don't really know where else to put this in the script, but I found it, and it's interesting, so I wanted to share it, especially with all the fans of this show. Chisato's design seems to be the one that went through the most revisions, at first looking completely different from how she ended up in the show. I do like her initial design, but I think she comes off very tender and motherly in this depiction, which doesn't really fit her character. In the end, I think the design that Chisato got in the final version of the anime is her best rendition. However, I am extremely partial to Takina's beta design. If you're not overly familiar with the anime, at a glance you might not be able to tell beta Takina apart from her final design. But comparing them side by side reveals their differences. Beta Takina looks like she would kill someone without hesitation nor mercy, on a dime, without remorse, and she might even get satisfaction from it. Basically, her initial design looks like what DA characterizes her as in episode 3, and honestly, I kinda wish we got the version of her character that this design implies. Actually, seeing the initial designs of both MCs, Beta Chisato paired with Beta Takina seems like a really fun dynamic. I kinda want that version of the show now. We get quite a few beta kurumis, but like Chisato, her final design deftly takes the cake. And lastly, here's Sakura, the design that kept getting rejected for being too cute. I reiterate, never forget what they took from us. Episode 13 is the worst episode of the entire show and single-handedly brought my score down from a 7 to a 6. It's not like the writing suddenly fell apart. The episode has intentionality with how it conducts itself, and it even has themes, but it hinges on whether or not the audience can get behind the decisions it makes. If you can get behind them, then you'll probably see nothing wrong with it, but I personally can't. It'll take a long time to explain why, but I hope you'll bear with me, because maybe, along the way, you'll learn a little something about audience expectations, how shows can go about setting them correctly, how to properly subvert expectations, and why I personally do not like this ending. So, what's Lycoris Recoil actually about? I've been delaying talking about it in depth until now, because even that is a complicated question. Episode 1 starts with an explanation through Chisato's monologue of what licorice are. Female child assassins whose purpose is to stop crimes before they even happen. This is done through extremely efficient and effective information networks which I imagine are rather privacy invading considering their efficacy. Acts of terror are regularly covered up, reported to the public as benign accidents. Direct Attack, or DA, is the organization that upholds this system. It exists outside the law and will use any means necessary to continue operations. At the end of the opening monologue, Chisato says that to be able to think that Japan is the most peaceful, safest country on Earth because of this system makes her the happiest. At least, that's what I was told. This line is a tacit declaration that Chisato's brain is filled with propaganda, and there will likely be some point in the narrative where she begins to question these beliefs. To see this happen, you just need to keep watching. It's easy to see why this hooked people. In less than 2 minutes, we've already set up an ideological discussion about freedom versus security. Is safety in itself integral to freedom? If so, how do we tip the scales such that we are as free and safe as possible? How much authority is too much authority? Should a shadow government be able to gat people without trial? Hell, should we have a death penalty at all? Obviously, at this point in the show, we're not deep into this pile of questions just yet, but nonetheless, it gets your mind a-whirring, doesn't it? Our main characters are both licorice, but they're considered bad at following orders. A good licorice follows everything they are told unquestioningly. A bad licorice puts their own autonomy before their orders. While Takina desperately wants to go back to DA, Chisato is intentionally unruly and proud of that fact. She's also a pacifist, which DA is none too keen on. A good licorice kills those who disrupt order. A bad one is anti-death penalty. One of our main characters has explicit ideological differences with DA. I wonder where the show would be going with this. Mayhaps DA stands for the latter two letters in bad. In episode 3, it's revealed that DA used Takina as a scapegoat to cover up the fact that they were unable to stop a hacking during a mission. The anime makes a point to show that pretty much everyone in DA hates her guts because of the propaganda that's been going around, and it marks the clear beginning of Takina's shift to not caring about no DA anymore. I wonder where this is going. In episode 4, we're introduced to our main villain Majima. We get that he hates the fact that DA is lying to people, wants to expose them to the world, and he thinks they're screwing with the balance of Japan or whatever. It's vague at this point, but judging from the current trajectory of the show, no one would blame you for extrapolating a bit on his beliefs and finding yourself with a story where Majima embodies everything that DA is not. After all, that's a pretty cool motivation for a villain, and allows all sorts of fascinating themes to bubble up to the surface. Are ya getting hyped yet? Over time, we learn a bit more about his stances. He taunts the licorice about what the public would think about their existence if they knew, implying he agrees with what the public, and probably the viewer, would think about an invisible autocratic regime. And most notably, he hides 1,000 guns all over Tokyo, which on my first viewing was pretty much my favorite scene in the show. So about 100 of you in Tokyo were able to enjoy your first gun, and your first freedom. There are 3,000 people who go missing each year. I wonder how many of them got snuffed by the licorice. Geez, Rick, if I had to take a stab at what Majima's motivations might be, I think he might, quite possibly, perhaps, dislike the fact that an autocratic shadow government is taking people's freedom away in the name of security and killing them without trial. I mean, everything points to that being the case, right? I wouldn't be surprised if Majima's next PSA had him rambling in front of a "Don't Tread on Me" flag about how the Civil War was actually about state rights. Okay, I'm taking the piss now, but I do mean it when I say that this all feels like it's building towards something pretty dang cool. And I certainly wasn't the first nor last person to think that. Sure is a shame that I was lying to you this whole time. Or maybe the show was lying to us. Was it? In episode 13, we witness Majima's big ideological speech to Chisato. Now, by this point, the warning signs were beginning to make themselves apparent, most notably being that we're on the final episode and still waiting for the show to say something about these themes. But this is the nail that caused the coffin to crumble. I thought you wanted to break this place. If that were the case, I would have done so immediately. Okay, things are getting dicey already. For reference, this place is Enkuboku, a symbol of peace in Japan, built to commemorate the lie sold by the licorice. Majima made like he was gonna blow the whole thing to smithereens, but apparently he doesn't actually want to. What are his true motivations? I'm always siding with the weak. If DA was the weaker side, I'd be helping you guys out! And it's at this point that the first time I watched this show, I paused the video and just sat there losing my mind for the next 5 minutes. I kept waiting for the moment where Majima would talk about my big government and the copious amounts of civilian spying that are almost certainly happening in this world, and how killing people without trial is bad, and yada yada, etc, etc. That stuff goes right for the jugular in terms of what this narrative's themes ostensibly are, but that's not what happens. DA has instated a false peace. They claim that Japan is #1 in public safety, but in actuality, its horrors have simply been veiled. The public didn't earn that peace. A civilization that doesn't earn its peace forgets the harsh reality, and becomes weak, complacent, easy for evil to then take advantage of. Of course, you can't just get rid of evil. Selfishness is hardwired into human nature. It's best for the world then if the two sides are left to their own devices in balance. But DA messed with that balance by covering up the existence of the other side. So, Majima allied with the weaker side. Terrorists, and wants to reveal DA to the public in order to get that balance back. If the terrorists were too powerful, Majima would side with the shadow government, at least until balance was restored. You destroy, I destroy. You leave, we leave. Perfectly balanced, as all things should be. I take issue with this scene, but it's really difficult to voice my gripes with it for a plethora of reasons. Firstly, while this scene is definitely the one that made me the angriest on both watch-throughs of this show, there are really problems with the anime as a whole. It's just here that what were previously fears in the back of my head became, wow, that was disappointing. But secondly, it's not like the show tried to do something but failed to execute it well. It's just doing an idea that I didn't want it to execute in the first place. Majima's ideology has little to do with authoritarianism. He dislikes that DA is lying to the public, which I'm sure anyone with a pulse would agree with. But all this stuff about balance and false peace, while arguably interesting, has nothing to do with big government. Maybe Majima is part of the Snake Gang, considering he gives the public guns, but that's not explored in the anime, nor is it even made clear if Majima believes in all that. That's not to mention that the show doesn't even do much with his beliefs about false peace either. All it really leads to is this corny-ass line about how the only real villains are behind the silver screen. It's almost enough to make you wonder if maybe the anime was never trying to be political to begin with. And that's the thing. Lycoris is one giant troll, and that's a feature, not a bug. And I don't think I fully realized that until re-watching it. Soon after Majima's ideology is revealed, Chisato, finally, as all the shippers were desperate for, comes out of the closet as a centrist. What's going on in the world? I don't care. That's so trivial. You don't have any ambitions? I do. I want to do what I can for the people who need me. That way, I might remain in the memories of that person, right? During the climax of a story with political and ideological undertones, the point we're told to take away is that our main character never really cared about any of that. She was fighting for her friends so that they'd remember her. And that's when you realize, freedom versus security was never the point. DA and its wretched system was first and foremost an excuse to have cute girls with guns fighting cool villains, each with their own personal motivations, and secondly, to communicate one of this show's actual themes of autonomy. As the series goes on, Takina becomes less of a pawn for DA and more often makes decisions of her own volition. Near the end of the show, she talks to Majima when she was supposed to stay silent. She confronts him directly even though she wasn't supposed to. Disobeying authority is absolutely something that the series supports. This is why the series doesn't critique Chisato for her pacifism nor her limited worldview. This is why her decision to live outside of DA is portrayed as good. She's exercising her autonomy to do her own thing, even though DA disapproves of it. The series wants you to act on your own conviction instead of someone else's, and that seems to be its main message. It was never actually about challenging the system. It was just about learning to follow your own values. And that's what makes this kinda hard to criticize. The series' disregard of the freedom versus security debate is intentional, which is why during the series' conception, the cute girls with guns aspect was created before DA. And on top of that, it's not even like the series doesn't have themes, but I hope I can make a case, at the very least, for why I was outright annoyed by the finale. First of all, I just think it's
lame as hell
that the show doesn't take a more ideological approach to its concept, and you can't argue with that. But secondly, it's the way the show failed to properly align at least my expectations with its goals that killed it. It's not like I need every show to have an ideological tinge to it. I like SpongeBob, though really who doesn't? But I'm not asking SpongeBob to have a thoughtful takedown of ruthless authoritarianism now, am I? Because you wouldn't even begin to expect that from the show. It'd be outright unfair to ask SpongeBob to do that. But that's an easy example. Let's go with something a bit more gray. Made in Abyss features a society of explorers who venture down into a literal death pit from which, at a certain depth, they can never return. It is considered honorable in this society to give up your life to explore this hole. There's no need to explore it. Sure, you can sell some of the cool stuff in it for money, but otherwise you're just going there to satisfy your curiosity and get the glory. And yet, this entire society was built by explorers to go down this hole, and in doing so, they've created what is essentially a third world micronation filled with slums and terrible living conditions. Furthermore, this society trains orphans from birth to go down this same agony tunnel, and instills in them the value of exploration and curiosity. The children go down the murder trench and occasionally meet monsters that could kill them in seconds, but that's okay, because the children bring back sick relics from the pit to make the orphanage money, which they can then use to send more children down the suffering orifice. Made in Abyss does not criticize this system. In fact, its protagonist Riko never even begins to question the society that raised her. So like, why aren't I critical of this aspect in MIA? Because from the very offset, it's obvious that this isn't what the story is about. The show starts us off in the gore shaft, and makes us witness to how epic it is. It sparks our curiosity too, to the point where we start to understand why the society wants to explore it so badly. We both expect and want the characters to journey down the depression, and the show knows we want to, which is why it swiftly meets those expectations. Made in Abyss aligns our expectations with its goals. But Lycoris doesn't. It begins with an explanation of what the licorice are, which is necessary world building, but also immediately gives the show a political tinge. A line I specifically want to fixate on though, and that I quoted earlier, is "That's what I was told," which comes from Chisato's monologue in regards to the values DA instilled in her. I struggle to think of ways you could more plainly signpost to the audience that they should start questioning whoever told Chisato this, and that Chisato will at some point be doing some questioning as well. These first moments give us an idea as to what the series' priorities are, but it's a false sense of them. It immediately gets your brain thinking about questions that don't go anywhere and a future character conflict that doesn't exist. And listen, starting on this scene probably wouldn't even be a bad decision if the show then realigned the audience's expectations as quickly as it could. Instead, the show tempts us with a really interesting ideological conflict between Majima and DA that cucks you if you get your hopes up. I guess you could argue that the show ripping the ideological aspect of the narrative away from the audience at the last minute functions as an effective plot twist, but IMHO, a plot twist only works if the story is more interesting after the twist. I think the show was way cooler when Majima and DA represented two sides of a fascinating, age-old political conflict, not when all these elements are just disconnected set pieces through which the show displays Takina's character development and explores its more personal conflict about following your conviction. This also plays into another issue I have with the show. It feels like a disparate patchwork of unrelated ideas that don't really come together to form a cohesive whole. We already talked at length about how Majima's motivations don't fit the setup, and how the licorice system is never criticized despite the show feeling like it's going in that direction, but I also want to bring up some other aspects of the show. Chisato considers herself a pacifist, but Yoshimatsu believes that she's a genius for killing. killing. He also runs the Allen Institute, which helps geniuses fulfill their potential. So, he puts Chisato in a position where she must kill someone to save both herself and her friend. She chooses not to stay true to her conviction and keep her autonomy. Makes enough sense with the autonomy theme, right? I mean, Yoshimatsu's ideology is a bit random, but it's interesting, and it works as the justification to try and force Chisato to abandon her conviction. But here's the thing. Takina and Chisato have a bit of a clashing dynamic in this regard. One of the main pieces of imagery associated with Lycoris Recoil is this one of Takina pointing a gun at Chisato while Chisato holds a spider lily towards Takina. This is an extremely evocative piece of imagery. Chisato upholds pacifism, while Takina upholds morally justifiable violence. This one image is probably the thing that will stick with me the longest in the show. Spider lilies are also toxic, by the way, so the symbolism doesn't work. This is the true problem with the show. This conflict of ideologies, despite feeling like it could go somewhere, and probably should've, doesn't. So, to list a few things off, we have a conflict about freedom versus security, with two characters whose conflict is pacifism versus justifiable violence, with one villain whose ideology is that genius's talent needs to be delivered to the world, and another who wants to restore the balance between good and evil. These elements are used to tell a story about autonomy and how everyone believes they're on the side of justice. Forgive me for feeling like the story of this show may be a tad disjointed. And maybe this all could have worked with better execution. But to me, it all seems like just a few too many ingredients in the stew that don't quite come together harmoniously. The stuff about everyone believing they're on the side of justice should work with all this on paper, but the way it was implemented into the show feels like it was shoehorned in at the last minute. Meanwhile, the autonomy theme was much more naturally implemented. It's a very chaotic brand of storytelling, and I've even heard some praise for its roughness, but I personally can't help but wish this show's ideas gelled together better. There's a lot more I could criticize about this show, like Mika undoing Chisato's most powerful character choice, thereby ripping her autonomy away from her in the biggest wet fart of a narrative decision I've seen in a while, or Chisato preposterously sending a man hurtling down a building in a fall that should kill him despite her being a pacifist, or how my Yuri pining heart got earnestly cucked, just as I could resume praising its stellar slice of life and some of the cool-ass shots and good animation and fun character moments and emotional scenes, but this video's gone on long enough, so I'll transition to an outro already. I wasn't joking when I said that this show has lived rent-free in my head far longer than most. In fact, back when I was still editing the Tomozaki video, I actually started writing the first version of this script. This has been cooking since before I even came back to YouTube, and honestly, I don't really know what to classify this video as. Is it a review, or more like a retrospective? It's certainly the most bizarrely structured and chaotic video I've ever created. I guess it's one giant thought dump on a show that's been on my mind for way longer than any other show I've given a 6 out of 10 to. But you know what? I think this messy video is fitting for an equally messy show. I want all shows to be good, obviously, but there's a part of me that can't help but be in love with the journey I had with this anime. From 4 out of 10 to 6 out of 10, this show lives in the deepest parts of my brain all the same. If nothing else, Lycoris Recoil sure is memorable. Yo! If you enjoyed this video, consider supporting me on Patreon. It helps make this whole YouTube shebang a viable future career path for me. And I have some absolute bangers cooking up in the background right now, which I trust you'll get some enjoyment out of. And with that... Welcome to the Patron Rap. I don't know why I thought this was a good idea. Bidoofus, CJ, Funky Boy Haas, dropping bars in the tundra. Now pass me the muskox. Jose Ramirez, Karen Chan. Does anyone else remember Ni Hao Kai Lan? Katie Pack, Minnie, Neon Manta. I'm not sorry I delayed a podcast recording to write this. Alviland, Copplestone, Alexander. Why are you dating? A salamander. Dr. Awu, Logan Noss. For your dental health, you should probably floss! Mic drop! Oh snap! You just got roasted by MC Bagel, the greatest rappist in the world! For more bars like this, you should go to my second channel, Neon Manta.